They called her the Wild Girl, though no one knew her real name. She had been passed from hand to hand, like a burden no one wanted but everyone thought they could tame. Men wagered bets over her spirit, her stubbornness, her untamed fire that flashed in her eyes whenever someone tried to control her. She'd been sold before, worked like an animal, beaten when she wouldn't bend, but never once had she surrendered. She was skin and bone, dust and fury, her hair tangled like the prairie grass in the wind, her voice sharp as the cry of a hawk. When the auctioneer's hammer fell that day, the men laughed as if the rancher had been played for a fool. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-worn skin and steady gray eyes that didn't flinch under anyone's stare. He bought her for more than any man thought she was worth. Not because he believed she'd be a servant or a prize, but because when he looked at her, he saw something in her fire that reminded him of the storms that swept across the plains. Dangerous, yes, but alive, pure, untouchable. She met his gaze with defiance, her chin lifted high, daring him to try what the others had failed. The ride back to his ranch was silent except for the hooves striking the dry earth. She didn't speak, didn't ask where he was taking her. She just sat stiff, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the endless horizon. He didn't try to fill the silence, didn't try to coax her or threaten her. He simply let the wind talk between them. On the ranch, she refused to eat at first, refused to work, refused to so much as acknowledge his existence. She kept her distance, always watchful, always ready to fight. The men working under him shook their heads, muttering that the boss had wasted his money. "That one'll never break," they said. "She's too wild. She ain't got no place in a home." But the rancher wasn't trying to break her. He didn't tie her down. He didn't raise his hand. Instead, he gave her space, let her wander the land like one of his unbroken horses. He left food where she could take it without asking. He gave her a room that wasn't locked. He treated her less like property and more like something fragile and dangerous at once, something to be respected. It was the horses that changed her. She would slip out to the corral when she thought no one was watching, leaning against the fence, studying the mustangs as they bucked and reared, refusing the rope. She saw herself in them, fighting with every ounce of strength not to belong to anyone. One evening, the rancher stepped beside her at the fence. She stiffened, ready for a command or a threat. But he only leaned his arms against the rail and said, "They're not broken, just waiting for someone who knows how to listen." His voice was low, steady, carrying no weight of demand. For the first time, her eyes flicked toward him not with anger but with curiosity. Days turned into weeks. She began to eat at the table, though she never sat close. She started to speak in short, clipped words, her voice rough from disuse. She touched one of the horses, just a brush of her hand along its mane, and when it didn't bolt, her breath caught in wonder. The rancher saw it, that flicker of softness breaking through the hardened shell. He never pushed, never rushed her. He just kept building fences, mending saddles, doing the work of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to give. One night, a storm rolled over the plains, fierce and howling, rattling the windows and shaking the barns. Lightning split the sky, and the horses panicked, thrashing against the rails. She ran out into the storm, barefoot, hair whipping in the wind, crying out to calm them. The rancher was right behind her, his hand steadying her when the rain nearly knocked her down. Together they soothed the terrified animals, their voices rising above the thunder, side by side, until the storm finally passed. When it was over, she collapsed against him, trembling with exhaustion, rain dripping from her lashes. For the first time, she let herself lean on him. For the first time, she didn't pull away. His arm wrapped around her, strong and sure, not to trap her but to keep her standing. And in that moment, she realized he wasn't her captor. He was her shelter. The men at the ranch stopped calling her the Wild Girl. They started calling her by the name the rancher had given her, a name that carried dignity instead of shame. She walked with her head high, not in defiance now, but in belonging. And though the fire in her eyes never dimmed, it no longer burned with anger but with a light that warmed instead of scorched. He hadn't broken her. He had freed her, and in doing so, she had ridden straight into the place she thought she'd never find, his heart. The days on the ranch began to stretch into a rhythm, the kind of rhythm that made time itself slow down in the wide open spaces. The sun rose each morning with a fire that painted the sky, and she found herself awake before it crested the horizon, drawn to the stillness of dawn. She would walk barefoot in the grass, the dew damp against her skin, and watch the horses as they stirred from their sleep. There was peace there, a kind of wordless freedom that filled her chest, though she fought to keep her heart from acknowledging it. For years she had been passed around like a commodity, denied her own choices, and she feared that to let herself feel safe was to step into another trap. The rancher never pressed her. He rose early too, always already at work when she drifted back toward the house. Sometimes she would catch him in the glow of the rising sun, sleeves rolled to his elbows, arms strong and deliberate as he carried hay or repaired a fence. There was something steady about him, something that grounded the very air around him. She told herself she didn't care, that she owed him nothing, but her eyes kept finding him, watching the way he moved as though each action carried purpose. She still tested her boundaries, half expecting at any moment that he would reveal himself like all the others, demanding, cruel, claiming ownership. She would refuse a chore he asked of her just to see what he would do. Instead of anger, he only shrugged and did it himself. When she slammed the door of the little room he had given her, waiting for the rage of a man denied control, there was only silence. No one came pounding. No one dragged her out. That silence disarmed her more than any act of violence could. It unsettled her, shook the ground of her defenses, because silence left room for trust to grow. The horses were her undoing. She could not stay away from them, not from the sleek dark stallion with fire in his veins, nor the gentle mare with eyes soft as the evening sky. She began to spend her days in the corral, moving closer with each sunrise. She spoke to them in whispers, words she hadn't spoken to anyone in years, as though they alone could hold the secrets of her bruised heart. One afternoon, the rancher stood by as she extended her hand to the stallion, and for the first time, the animal lowered his great head and let her touch him. Her fingers brushed his mane, trembling, and a sound caught in her throat that was half sob, half laughter. She turned, and the rancher was watching her, his gray eyes softer than she had ever seen. She looked away quickly, afraid he might see too much. Nights came quietly on the plains. After supper, the men would linger around the fire, trading stories, their laughter echoing against the stars. At first she stayed inside, clutching her solitude, but little by little she found herself drawn out, sitting on the edge of the circle. She didn't speak, but she listened, the warmth of the fire easing the cold corners of her spirit. The men, who had once muttered about her wildness, grew used to her presence. They stopped treating her as an intruder and began to offer her the small gestures of belonging, an extra plate of beans, a blanket when the night grew chill, a nod of acknowledgement when she passed. She realized, slowly and with disbelief, that no one here was trying to strip her of herself. The storm that had shaken the ranch left its mark on her. She had felt the raw power of nature tearing through the land, and in its fury, she had discovered a part of herself she thought long buried, the part that cared, the part that fought not for her own survival but for something outside herself. Standing beside the rancher that night, shouting above the thunder, calming the horses with him, had bound her to him in a way she could not easily untangle. She told herself it was nothing, a fleeting moment forced by necessity. But when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the strength of his arm steadying her, still hear the calm of his voice in the chaos. The weeks turned into months. Her hair grew long again, no longer matted, but shining in the sunlight. Her skin, once pale from neglect, darkened with the sun, healthy and strong. She laughed one evening, an unguarded, sudden laugh at something one of the men said, and the sound startled her as much as it did them. It had been so long since she'd heard it, she barely recognized it as her own. The rancher turned his head sharply at the sound, and for the first time, she saw him smile fully, a smile that reached his eyes, and her heart stumbled in her chest. Still, she wrestled with herself. Trust was not something she could offer lightly. Too many hands had tried to break her, too many voices had told her she was worth nothing. Sometimes, late at night, she would wake from dreams drenched in fear, her body shaking, her mind replaying the cruelty she had endured. On those nights, she would slip outside, breathing the cold air, trying to remind herself she was free now. Once, the rancher found her there, sitting on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees. He didn't speak. He only sat down beside her, close enough that she felt the heat of him, far enough that she could breathe. After a long silence, he said, "No one's gonna hurt you here. Not while I'm alive." His voice carried no promise he couldn't keep, just a certainty as strong as the land itself. For the first time, she believed him. She began to ride the horses, timidly at first, then with growing confidence. The stallion that had once fought every hand now responded to her, as though he saw in her the same wildness that lived in himself. She would ride him across the fields, hair flying behind her, the wind tearing tears from her eyes, and in those moments she felt utterly alive. The rancher would watch from a distance, his heart swelling, though he never spoke of it. She belonged nowhere and everywhere at once, and he knew that the land had finally given him something he hadn't even realized he was waiting for. The men began to whisper not of her wildness but of her courage. They saw the way she rode, the way she carried herself with pride. They saw how she worked alongside them, her hands blistered and calloused, never asking for special treatment. They began to respect her, and with respect came acceptance. She was no longer an outsider. She was one of them. It was not a single moment that bound her to the rancher, but 1,000 small ones. The way he poured her coffee in the morning without asking how she liked it, because he had already learned. The way he fixed the hinge on her door when it squeaked, never saying a word about it. The way he stood between her and the world when strangers came through, his presence enough to keep their curiosity at bay. Slowly, imperceptibly, her heart began to lean toward him, like a flower turning toward the sun, though she fought against it with every breath. The hardest part was believing she was worthy of it. Worthy of kindness. Worthy of belonging. Worthy of love. She had been told all her life that she was nothing, and now here was a man who treated her as if she were everything. That kind of shift did not come easily. She would catch herself staring at him when he wasn't looking, studying the lines of his face, the way his eyes softened when he watched the land, the strength in his hands. And when he caught her gaze, she would look away quickly, cheeks burning, afraid of what he might see in her eyes. But the rancher was patient. He knew that the wildest horses, once they chose you, would give you their whole heart. He would wait as long as it took. He didn't need her to be tamed. He only needed her to be free, free enough to choose him. And little by little, she did. She chose him in the mornings when she sat at his table without hesitation. She chose him in the afternoons when she rode beside him across the fields. She chose him in the evenings when she lingered near the fire, her laughter mingling with his. She chose him in the silence, in the storm, in the stillness of the night. Until one day, without realizing it, she had ridden straight into his heart and found it waiting wide open, strong enough to hold her wildness and gentle enough to let her soar. One morning the sound of hooves broke the calm. Dust rose on the horizon, carrying with it the thud of unfamiliar riders. She froze at the sight, her body stiffening as memories clawed their way back. Men with hard eyes, cruel hands, the sound of laughter that carried no warmth. The rancher saw the fierce spark in her face before she even spoke. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and the approaching men, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. The riders pulled up, their eyes scanning the place with a hunger she recognized too well. One of them leaned forward in the saddle, his grin sharp. "Heard you got yourself a wild one here," he drawled. "Reckon we know her. She belongs to us." The words cut through her like a blade. She wanted to run, to vanish into the hills, but her legs wouldn't move. The rancher's voice was steady, cold as steel. "She belongs to no one." The men laughed, the sound ugly in the open air. "We'll see about that," one spat, his hand twitching toward his belt. In a flash, the rancher's gun was drawn, gleaming in the sun. The silence that followed was sharp, hanging heavy between them. His voice dropped, low and certain. "Ride on. This land's not yours, and neither is she." For a moment it seemed they might press it, but something in his eyes made them think twice. They muttered curses, spat in the dirt, and finally turned their horses. She didn't breathe until the dust of their departure faded into the horizon. When she looked at him, her throat tight, her hands trembling, he was sliding his revolver back into its holster as if nothing had happened. "No one's talkin', you," he said simply, his eyes locking with hers. "Not now. Not ever." Something inside her broke then, not the wildness, not the fire, but the wall she had built so high around her heart. For the first time in years, tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She didn't hide them. She didn't turn away. She let him see the storm inside her, and instead of flinching, he stepped closer, his hand hovering before finally resting lightly on her shoulder. The touch wasn't a claim, wasn't a chain. It was a promise. After that day, her bond with the ranch grew deeper. She threw herself into the work, rising with the sun, mending fences, hauling water, learning the rhythm of cattle drives. The men no longer questioned her place. She had proven herself through grit and sweat, and they respected her as much as they respected the land itself. Sometimes they would joke with her, their voices light, and she would answer with words that still felt strange in her mouth, playful, teasing words that tasted like freedom. The stallion became her shadow. He followed her voice, trusted her touch, carried her across the plains with a speed that made the earth blur beneath her. Together they were unstoppable, two wild souls finding strength in each other. The rancher watched them ride, a quiet pride in his eyes, as though seeing her free was more important than anything else he could hold. But healing is never straight. There were nights when shadows of the past clawed her awake, sweat cold on her skin, her breath ragged. Once, in the dead of night, she stumbled outside, desperate to breathe, to shake off the weight of memory. The rancher followed, silent as the night itself, and when she turned to him with eyes wide and broken, he didn't ask for words. He only wrapped his coat around her shoulders and stood there with her until the fear ebbed. She realized then that he wasn't trying to fix her. He was simply standing beside her while she mended herself. That, she thought, was a kind of love she had never known could exist. The seasons turned. Winter brought snow that blanketed the fields, the nights long and cold. The ranch house became a refuge, the fire crackling while the wind howled outside. She learned to cook alongside the ranch hands, her hands busy with bread and stew, her laughter mingling with theirs. The rancher would sit at the head of the table, his eyes finding hers across the flames, and though no words passed, something unspoken grew strong between them. Spring thawed the earth, and with it came new life, calves stumbling on wobbly legs, flowers pushing through the soil. She found herself laughing more easily, moving with a lightness she had thought forever lost. The rancher noticed, though he never said it aloud, the way her steps had changed from guarded to free. He saw her hair shining in the sunlight, her face softened by peace, and his chest ached with a gratitude too deep to name. But peace is always tested. One evening, near dusk, the men from before returned. This time there were more of them, and they weren't laughing. They demanded she be handed over, claiming debts, ownership, lies wrapped in the language of possession. The rancher stood firm, his men at his side, but the air cracked with tension, the kind that could ignite with the smallest spark. She stepped forward, surprising them all, her voice ringing out across the dirt yard. "I'm not yours. I never was. I'll never be." The men sneered, but something in her stance, straight-backed, eyes blazing, made them falter. She was no longer the girl they had tried to sell and break. She was a woman who had found her ground. And behind her stood a rancher, solid as the mountains, his presence a shield. After a long silence, the men cursed and turned away, defeated not by guns but by the strength of a spirit they could not crush. That night, as the stars burned above them, she sat on the porch with the rancher. For a long while they said nothing, only listening to the crickets and the soft lowing of cattle in the distance. Then she spoke, her voice low but sure. "You didn't save me. You just gave me a place where I could save myself." He looked at her, his gray eyes steady, and answered softly, "That's all I ever wanted." The words lingered between them, heavy and sweet. She felt the truth of them deep in her bones. He hadn't tried to own her, hadn't tried to break her. He had seen her wildness not as something to destroy but as something worth protecting. And in that, he had won her heart, not by force, but by freedom. The days stretched into years. The ranch thrived, the horses grew strong, and the land bore witness to their bond. She was no longer the wild girl whispered about in town, no longer the nameless figure passed from hand to hand. She was a woman rooted in the soil of the ranch, in the strength of the horses, in the steady love of the man who had seen her not as a prize but as a person. And though her fire never dimmed, it burned now with a light that warmed everyone who drew near. She had been bought once, but she had never been broken. And in the end, she hadn't been claimed by chains or fear. She had chosen him, chosen the ranch, chosen herself. And that choice was the fiercest freedom of all.